A veteran park ranger once told me the most dangerous thing in this job is not what hunts above ground, but what waits beneath it. In these cavernous corridors, search dogs stop cold, lights fail without warning, and thermal cameras catch only freezing shapes pressed against the stone. People do not just get lost down here. They disappear into cracks too small to hold them, as if the caves are opening just long enough to take them. What if something ancient has been living under these caves all along? Across the country, hikers step into the dark and never come back out, leaving behind broken gear, trails that end at solid rock walls, and whispers of pale, scale-skinned creatures moving just beyond the beam of a flashlight. Down in the deep earth, something breathes, watches, and waits for the next light to flicker out. I'm Eli. As a park ranger, I've worked cases where people went missing, but the stories tonight are the ones I still can't explain, and the ones that come back to me in my nightmares. The first one that stayed with me happened a few years into my time working cave country search calls. By then, I already knew that people do not vanish underground the way they do in the open. On the surface, you get broken branches, dropped gear, boot tracks, signs of panic, signs of injury. In caves and caverns, the earth swallows too much. Sound shifts, air shifts, distances lie to you. And sometimes the only thing worse than finding nothing is finding one person who somehow made it back out. It was a youth cave exploration group, not a technical expedition, just a supervised outing through a mapped cavern system used for beginner runs. There were 2 adults and several teenagers, most of them more excited than careful, the way kids get when they think a place is dangerous, only in a fun kind of way. The route was supposed to take a few hours. They would go in, move through the wider chambers and low crawls, stop for lunch in the main room, and be back out by late afternoon. When they failed to return on time, nobody panicked right away. Delays happen underground. Groups move slower than expected. People get tired. But after dark, one of the boys came stumbling out of the trees near the access road alone, covered in mud, missing his helmet, and shaking so hard he could barely stand. He looked 15 at most. His lips were blue, his eyes were wild, and he kept looking back toward the cave mouth like he thought something had followed him all the way to the surface. They got him wrapped in blankets and tried questioning him before I even arrived, but he was too far gone to tell a straight story. He kept saying they heard breathing in the walls, kept saying the cave got colder the deeper they went, colder than it should have, and that one of the girls started whispering that somebody was saying her name from inside the stone. At first, the adults thought she was panicking, until they heard it too. He said the lights began to fail one by one, and after that, people were no longer where they were supposed to be. Every time he got close to the part that mattered, he froze. He would just stare past us and whisper, "They were in the rock." By the time I got my team together, the surviving boy was the only one topside. We moved in fast. I had 2 experienced rangers, 1 rescue tech, and a county cave specialist who knew the mapped routes better than most of the guides. The entrance itself was easy to miss if you did not know where to look. Just a dark slit in a rise of stone behind wet roots and broken rock. The kind of opening hikers walk past without realizing how much earth is hollow under their feet. It had rained 2 days earlier, and the ground around the cave mouth still held moisture. Our first clue came before we were fully inside. There were hiking prints in the mud near the entrance, several overlapping sets showing confusion and back and forth movement. But among them were other prints too, bare feet, long, narrow, deep through the toes. Too clear to dismiss as runoff or broken edges in the mud. I stood there with my light on them longer than I should have, saying nothing, because once you start giving shape to something like that underground, the dark gets heavier for everyone around you. The air changed about 50 yards in. At first it was the usual cave cold, damp, and mineral heavy, with that old earth smell all caverns have. Then it shifted. The deeper we went, the temperature dropped in strange pockets, and every so often we would step through a current of air so cold it felt mechanical, like opening the door of a deep freezer. The cave specialist muttered something about airflow and unstable chambers, but he did not sound convinced. Our lights picked out wet stone, slick walls, narrow turns, low ceilings, mineral curtains, and passages that widened and tightened without warning. Sound carried too far in some places and died completely in others. More than once I stopped because I thought I heard footsteps ahead, only to realize it was water moving somewhere deeper in the rock. We reached the first main chamber and found the group's lunch packs. Not all of them, just 3 day packs, a broken flashlight, a crushed helmet, and a half-opened bag of trail mix spilled across a flat stone as if someone had dropped it in a hurry. No bodies, no blood, no people. One of the adult leaders had tied a bright marker rope near the passage leading out, probably to keep the teenagers together on the way back. The rope had been cut clean through, not frayed, not torn on rock. Cut. That bothered me more than the missing gear did. It meant someone had tried to hold the group together after things started going bad, and something had undone that effort with intention. That was where the dog refused to go farther. We had one cave-trained search dog with us, a good animal that had worked lost hikers and recovery operations before. Up to that chamber, he had been tense but manageable. The second we tried to lead him toward the narrower corridor beyond it, he planted himself, whined low in his throat, and would not move. His handler tried coaxing him twice, then stopped because the dog's whole body had gone rigid. He kept staring into the dark ahead with the fur along his back standing straight up. Even after we pulled him back, he would not stop staring that direction. So we went on without him. The next corridor sloped downward into a part of the cavern system the maps marked but did not recommend for novice groups. Low ceiling, tight turn, a shallow crawl under a hanging shelf before it opened again. That was where we found more signs of panic. Smears of mud where hands had slipped on the rock, a scarf caught on a jagged edge, one shoe small enough to belong to a teenager. Then deeper in came the first thing I have never managed to explain away. On a stretch of wet clay floor, where every step had left a mark, we found the group's boot prints tangled over one another in a mess of panic and retreat. Running, stumbling, turning back, and crossing over them were barefoot impressions coming from the opposite direction. They were human in the roughest possible sense. Heel, arch, toes, but too long, too spread, too deliberate. The pressure sat hard in the front of the foot, as if whatever made them was more used to gripping slick stone than walking level ground. There were several sets, some larger, some smaller, one almost child-sized. That one turned my stomach worst of all. I did not have much time to think about it, because that was when we heard the crying. It came from farther ahead, thin and ragged, bouncing off the stone in a way that made it impossible to tell exactly where it began. A girl's voice, young, frightened, trying not to break apart and failing. Every man on that team heard it at the same time, because we all stopped. I called out, identified us, told her to keep talking if she could hear me. The crying stopped. Then a second later it started again, farther away, like it had moved. One of the rangers looked at me and said she could be wandering deeper in, disoriented. I wanted that explanation badly enough to almost believe it. We followed the sound into a lower chamber where the ceiling rose and the floor dipped into a dark basin. The thermal camera on one of the rescue techs had been mostly useless up to then, picking up only us and the warmer pockets near the entrance. But in that chamber, it showed something I still see when I close my eyes. At the far end of the room, beyond a curtain of hanging stone, there was a shape colder than everything around it. Human-sized, upright, black on the screen, not because it was absent, but because it was reading below the surrounding cave temperature in a place that should already have been as cold as stone allowed. The tech whispered that the unit had to be glitching. Then the shape slid sideways and vanished behind the stone curtain. We crossed that chamber carefully, and when I rounded the drape with my flashlight, I saw it. At first, my mind tried to make it into a person, because that was easier than admitting what it looked like. It was folded into a crack in the wall with its knees drawn high and one hand pressed to the rock. It was thin, but not with the thinness of simple starvation. It looked pared down, adapted, stripped for life in dark, narrow places. The ribs stood out. The shoulders were narrow. The arms were too long through the forearms, and the fingers were thin and jointed in a way that let them spread wide against the stone. The nails were dark and thick, more like hardened hooks than anything human hands should grow. Its skin in the flashlight beam was pale in some places and gray-brown in others, smeared with cave dirt and old mineral stains. But along the throat, the sides of the face, and one shoulder, the light caught a dry, overlapping texture that did not look like scars and did not look like normal skin. It had the faint, plate-like sheen of something reptilian, dull and tight, like the surface of a snake just before a shed. Small flakes clung along the ridge of its neck, where it had brushed the rock. Its hair hung in long wet ropes around a face that almost passed for human until you kept looking. The cheekbones were sharp, the nose flattened, the mouth hung slightly open, showing small uneven teeth dark at the gums. The eyes were what held me. Not glowing, not supernatural, just black looking in that beam, wide and steady and completely without fear. Then it made a sound, not a growl, not a word. A soft clicking deep in the throat. Something answered it from inside the crack. My whole body went cold. There was more than one. I swung the light toward the opening, and for half a second I saw movement beyond it. Another pale shape, smaller. Then the girl's crying started again from somewhere deeper still, and this time I knew it for what it was. Not a lost kid calling for help. A copy. A lure. The cave had been throwing sounds strangely all night, but this was more than echo. It was imitation. One of the rangers behind me whispered my name, and that was what snapped me back. I took one step forward anyway, trying to see into that fracture in the stone, and the thing in front of me lunged. It did not come fully out. It moved low and fast, one hand slapping the rock, shoulders twisting, head darting forward, with a speed that made the body seem to fold and unfold at the same time. I hit it with the flashlight before I even knew I had committed to the swing. The beam cracked across the side of its skull with a wet, heavy sound, and it recoiled into the opening with that same clicking cry, sharp now and angry. Then the whole dark beyond the crack answered back. Not one voice, several, some higher, some lower, all of them clicking in quick bursts that bounced through the chamber like insects trapped in a glass room. We pulled out right then, not because we were cowards, though fear had its hands all over me by then, but because I knew we were standing at the edge of a part of that cave system the map could no longer account for. The wall behind that crack was supposed to be solid according to survey. It was not. Something had passages back there, spaces just beyond our light, and whatever lived in them was not surprised to see us. That was the worst part. It did not act trapped. It acted interrupted. We kept searching the reachable sections for 2 more weeks. What had begun as a rescue slowly turned into a failed recovery. We found more gear. A second helmet split near the rim, a water bottle with deep bite marks pressed into the plastic, and one of the adult leader's blood-stained jackets wadded into a crack beneath a stone shelf nearly 15 feet up the cave wall. We found drag marks too, places where bodies or gear had been pulled across mud toward openings too narrow for any normal adult to enter. We found strange pale flakes caught on rough edges deeper in, thin and translucent like dry shed skin, but we never found the others. Officially, the report blamed confusion, separation, possible falls into unmapped shafts, and movement through unstable sections of the cave. That was what went on paper. It was all anyone would have accepted. But I know what I saw in that chamber. I know what made those barefoot prints. I know the crying we followed did not belong to any lost girl still waiting to be rescued. And I know that when we turned to leave, just before my light lost the far side of that chamber, I saw 3 more shapes standing motionless behind the stone drapes, thin and pale and nearly blending into the wall, watching us go. That was the first of the cave stories that still haunts my dreams. Because that was the first time I understood something in those caves and caverns was not just feeding or hiding. It was using the cave itself, the cold, the echoes, the dark, even the voices of the people it took. And once I understood that, every cave search after felt like stepping into a mouth that might decide to close. The second one came a few years after the youth group vanished, and by then I had learned to keep certain thoughts to myself. I still did the job. I still ran searches. I still went underground when somebody failed to come back out. But after that first cave call, I stopped stepping into caverns with the same confidence I had carried before. I trusted my instincts more. I watched the walls more. I listened harder when the air changed. I never said any of that out loud. In my line of work, a man can keep his credibility, or he can start talking about things breathing behind stone. He usually does not get to keep both. So I kept my mouth shut and tried to convince myself that what I had seen in that chamber had been some isolated horror buried deep in one bad cave system. Then came the call about the couple, and whatever comfort I had built for myself after the first incident did not last the night. They were newly married, or close enough to it that it made no difference. Young. The sort of pair people notice because they still move through the world like everything ahead of them would probably work out. Their car was found in the visitor lot at a cavern reserve a little over an hour from my district. Their check-in tags were still logged at the desk. Their route should have been simple. A marked lantern trail, a short guided path turned self-guided after renovations, with railings through the wider chambers and signs posted at every junction for the tourists who liked just enough darkness to call it adventure. They should have been back by mid-afternoon. By sunset, their friends called. By full dark, we were in the cave. The first unsettling thing was not what we found. It was what would not follow us. The dog handler had brought in a solid search dog, one with enough underground experience that he had worked 2 collapses in an old mine shaft recovery. That dog would approach the entrance, lower his head and stop. Not balk, not get distracted, stop. His nails dug into the damp stone, and he put his weight backward like somebody had tied a rope to his harness and started pulling him from the dark. The handler tried him twice, then crouched and checked his paws as if there had to be something on the ground causing it. There was nothing there. The dog only kept staring inside with his ears pinned flat and his chest fluttering too fast. I remember thinking, before we even crossed the threshold, that I should have turned around right then and admitted I had no business taking a team where an animal with better instincts than mine wanted no part of going. Instead, we went in. This cavern was different from the first. Bigger, wetter, more open in places, with walkways and railings in the front sections where visitors snapped photos and laughed too loudly because people get uncomfortable underground and fill it with noise. But once we moved past the public route and into the maintenance corridors and older chambers, the mood changed fast. The air smelled of wet stone, cold minerals, and stagnant water trapped in places the sun had never reached. Our lights swept over slick walls, deep pools, calcite drips, and passages that widened into blackness before narrowing again without warning. Water tapped somewhere beyond our hearing, and then seemed to move behind us instead. More than once, one of the men on my team turned his light sharply because he thought he heard breathing at his shoulder. Every time it was only echoes. At least that was what we told ourselves. We found the woman's scarf first, caught on a rough shoulder of stone near a side chamber closed off years earlier after an unstable ceiling shift. There was enough of it still snagged there to tell me it had not drifted in by accident. Something had pulled it hard. A little deeper in, we found the husband's flashlight, cracked and dead, lying beside a shallow mineral pool black enough to look like a hole in the earth. Then came the wedding ring. It sat on a flat shelf of stone beside the pool, placed there so neatly it might have been left as an offering. I do not mean dropped, not lost in a struggle. Set down, upright, gleaming in the beam of my light. The rescue tech with me muttered that maybe one of them had removed it to wash or cool swollen fingers. It sounded ridiculous, even as he said it. Nobody strips off a wedding ring in a cave while lost and frightened, and then leaves it balanced on a rock beside water, black enough to hide anything. I stood there looking at it longer than I should have, and it was not the ring itself that unsettled me most. It was the fact that there were no prints around it. The mud near the pool should have held something. Boots, knees, hand marks. There was nothing. Then the smell reached us. At first it was faint, almost hidden under the damp cave air. Old flowers, wet earth, something sweet turning sour. Then underneath that, another scent I recognized immediately and hated for it. A hot animal smell, like damp scales warmed under bad lights, mixed with rot and stale water. It made the back of my throat tighten. One of the younger rangers asked if a snake den could smell that strong in enclosed rock. I said no, but the answer did not satisfy either of us. That was when we heard the woman crying. It came from beyond the pool, from a low opening in the wall the maps labeled as impassable. Soft at first, ragged, the sound of somebody trying to stay quiet and failing. Every headlamp in that chamber turned toward it at once. I called out, identified us, asked her to keep speaking. The crying stopped, then returned a few seconds later from deeper in the dark, as if the voice had moved backward without anything walking. I had heard that once before. I knew then what the others did not yet know, and I felt the same cold pressure sink under my ribs. I told the rest of the team to hold the chamber and keep their lights on the opening while I checked it with one other ranger. The passage beyond the pool was low enough that we had to duck almost immediately. Water slicked the rock, and the walls narrowed into a throat of stone that forced us sideways in places. My light shook over wet mineral deposits, old mud, and scratch marks cut into the wall at shoulder height. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Farther in we found a shoe, the woman's judging from the size and style. It lay on its side in a patch of black grit, the heel strap torn half through. 10 feet beyond that we found the husband. At least we found part of him. He was alive when we reached him, though only just. Wedged between two stone shelves, in a place no one could have fallen by accident, half hidden behind a fold in the wall, shirt ripped open, one arm bent under him wrong. His eyes were open but unfocused, and his skin had that gray cast people get when shock is doing its work faster than blood loss. He tried to speak when I crouched beside him, but all that came out at first was a cracked wheeze. I told the ranger with me to call the chamber team in and get a stretcher line ready. The man's hand clamped onto my wrist with surprising force, and when he finally got enough air to shape words, he whispered his wife's name. I asked where his wife was. Tears slipped from his eyes, and it took all his effort to force out a single word: dead. I gave him some water while we waited for the stretcher, and in a voice so faint I could barely hear it, he said he'd heard her calling his name after they got separated near the pool. He followed the sound of her voice through the dark to an opening in the wall, too small for him to squeeze through. He said he saw shapes moving behind the stone. Then something dropped on him from above. He tried to tell me more, but he was too far gone. His eyes rolled toward the passage behind me, and his grip on my wrist tightened once, hard enough to hurt. That was when I heard the clicking. Not loud, not close, just a dry little throat sound from farther back in the passage. Then another. Then something moved across my light. I spun so fast I nearly slipped. At first I only caught pieces of it, a hand flattening against wet stone, a bent knee folding into shadow, the pale flash of skin. Then the beam settled and I saw it fully for one terrible second. It was pressed halfway into a vertical crack in the wall, body turned at an angle that should have dislocated every joint in it. The chest and face remained visible, but the rest of it seemed folded into the rock behind. Its skin looked stretched and slick in some places, but along the sides of the neck, the shoulders, and one temple the light caught a dry, overlapping pattern that looked less like skin than a layer of dull scales pressed flat and tight. Thin flakes clung along one collarbone, as if it had scraped itself passing through stone too narrow for it. Its eyes were wide and black-looking in the beam, not glowing, just deep and reflective like cave water. And its mouth, slightly open, showed a row of small sharp teeth and gums so dark they looked bruised. The clicking came from it, then the thing smiled. I know how insane that sounds. I do not care. It pulled one side of its mouth back just enough to show it understood exactly what I was. Prey, maybe. Intruder, definitely. Then it slipped sideways into the crack and vanished in a way that made my skin crawl so violently I almost gagged. It did not squeeze through the opening like a desperate animal. It seemed to fold, flatten, and flow into it like it had done that all its life. The ranger behind me whispered my name. I turned my light farther back, and for half a second I saw movement in two other fractures higher in the wall. Smaller shapes, one low to the ground, another hanging upside down or near enough to it that I could not understand how it held there. Then all of them were gone. The woman's crying started again. This time it came from above us. The man on the ground made a sound I have never forgotten, half sob and half warning. "That's not her," he said. Then the lights behind us in the chamber flickered, not all at once, but in a staggered dimming that sent the passage in and out of brightness. For those 2 or 3 seconds, everything in the cave seemed to change position. The black water behind us, the crack in the wall, the stretch of passage ahead. I heard movement to my right, close enough that the air shifted against my sleeve, and I whipped the beam around just in time to see another one descend from the stone above headfirst. Using hands and feet together, its body hugging the wall in a way no human spine ever could. This one was smaller than the first, maybe adolescent, if that word even means anything for creatures like that. It moved so fast that the details came in fragments: long wet hair, pale shoulders, a throat that worked under a skin texture like thin scales beneath damp mud, fingers too long through the last joint, teeth flashing in the beam. It came straight for the injured man. I got between them without thinking. The flashlight in my hand was heavy metal, and I swung it hard enough to feel the impact up my arm. It struck the side of the creature's face with a sound like cracking wet wood. It dropped back, not far, just enough to recoil against the wall. But I was close enough then to smell it fully. Damp stone, stagnant water, rotting meat, and that reptile house heat underneath. The smell of a place where sunlight has not touched living skin in a very long time. Sounds exploded around me, clicks from the rock, scraping from the ceiling, a hiss so low it barely rose above the sound of our breathing. There was a splash in the water. I yelled at my partner that we had to get the husband out of there now. He grabbed him under the shoulders, I took his legs, and we dragged him back through the mud toward the next chamber. I backed out with my light raised toward the darkness behind us, waiting for something to come spilling out of it. By the time we reached the next chamber, the rest of the rescue team was already moving toward us, their lights cutting hard through the dark. We handed the husband off fast, and that was when I finally got a clear look back into the passage we had come through. I never saw the creatures come fully out again, but I saw enough. Hands braced against the rock, faces slipping in and out of cracks, a shoulder brushing the edge of the beam, eyes opening and closing from gaps in the wall as though the stone itself were watching us. Once, just before we pulled completely back into the chamber, I looked up and saw something clinging flat to the ceiling above the passage, ribs and limbs drawn in tight like a lizard, its face angled down toward mine. Then we were out in the wider chamber, and whatever lived beyond that passage stopped at the narrowing just short of the open light. We got the husband back to the surface alive. His wife never came out. We searched for another 12 days. What started as a rescue turned into a recovery effort, and then into the kind of report nobody likes signing. We found more signs. A torn section of her jacket caught on a blade of stone 3 feet above any footing. Blood smears on a wall beside an opening no adult could fit through. Long scuffs in the mud leading to cracks and then simply ending there. Once, one of the rescue techs swore he saw a pale face watching from behind a mineral column in a chamber we had already cleared. By the time he got the light back on it, there was nothing there but damp rock and silence. We never found her body. Officially, she was listed as presumed dead and unrecoverable due to unstable terrain. That was the language. Clean, empty, useless. Although the husband survived, he spent several days in the hospital before he was stable enough for me to question him. Even then, trauma had hollowed him out. What he gave me was not a full statement, just fragments. He said he heard her crying and followed the sound through the inky darkness of the caverns, down one passage and then the next. He could hear her breathing, but he could not see her. Then something touched the back of his neck. It attacked before he ever saw it. When I asked if the thing that attacked him had looked human, he stared at me for a long time and finally said, it knew how to look human enough. That second encounter stayed with me because it brought me closer than the first one had. Close enough to smell them. Close enough to see that scale-like texture on the neck and shoulders. Close enough to understand that whatever lived in those caves and caverns was not just surviving down there. It was built for it. Adapted to the cold pockets, the narrow fractures, the black water, the echoing dark. And once you understand that, every cave becomes harder to trust, because you start looking at the walls differently. You start wondering how much of what seems solid is only a door waiting for something on the other side to decide it is hungry. After that second search, I could not tell myself anymore that the caves were only hiding feral people or lost things with human faces. I had been too close for that. Close enough to smell them, close enough to hear them moving behind the stone, close enough to see the dry, scale-like texture of their skin where the beam caught them before they slipped back into the dark. Whatever lived down there belonged to those caverns in a way no human being ever could. I kept that to myself and kept doing the job because people were still going missing underground, and fear does not excuse you from going after them. But after that, every cave call felt heavier, every passage looked deeper, and every black opening in the rock started to feel like the mouth of something waiting. The third story began with a father's call to report his daughter and her friends missing. She was 19, a college sophomore home for the summer, and she and two friends had signed into a cavern system popular with hikers who wanted the thrill of going underground without paying for a guide. It was not a smart place to wander without experience, but every year people did it anyway. The front chambers were broad enough and forgiving enough to convince them the rest would be too. The girls were supposed to be in and out by late afternoon. When they did not come back, the father drove out himself before dark, thinking maybe they had a dead battery or had gone to the wrong exit. By the time I got there, his truck was parked crooked in the lot. His hands were shaking, and he had already tried to go in after them twice before the seasonal staff stopped him. One of the girl's friends had answered her phone once from somewhere underground, but all the father heard was crying, heavy breathing, and his daughter saying, "Dad, something is in here with us." He said he heard a scream, and then the line went dead. We went in before sunrise. There were 4 of us that morning. We had years of cave rescue experience between us. We had ropes, first aid, enough light to make ourselves feel better, and maps that had stopped being trustworthy for me a long time before. The father stopped me before I went down. He just caught my sleeve and asked me, with the kind of desperation no parent should ever have to feel, whether I thought she was still alive. I told him I did not know. It was the truth. Then I went underground with his hope still on my arm like weight. The entrance sloped steeply into a damp corridor where the air stayed cool even in summer. At first, the route followed what passed for a known recreational trail underground. Painted arrows, old rail cables in a few spots, a scattering of beer cans and broken glow sticks left by idiots who had treated the place like a dumping ground. About a quarter-mile in, we found the first sign the girls had gone off the marked route. One pink backpack sitting alone on a ledge beside a narrow side passage, unzipped, one strap broken, a water bottle still tucked in the side pocket. Not dropped in panic, set down in haste. A little farther in, we found a phone with the screen shattered and mud packed into the charging port. Beyond that, the cave changed. The walls narrowed, the air got colder. The smell shifted from ordinary cave damp into something fouler, something layered. Wet stone, stale water, old animal filth. Something sweet and rotten underneath, faint at first, and then stronger the deeper we went. There were scratch marks at shoulder height in one corridor where the rock had a softer mineral skin over it, long parallel scores running along the wall as if something with hard nails had gripped there repeatedly over time. One of the rangers said maybe bats or raccoons sometimes got trapped in sections like this. I did not answer, because those marks were too high, too deliberate, and too evenly spaced to belong to any trapped scavenger. We found the first girl's body before we found the others. She was wedged in a narrow pocket off the passage about 6 feet above the floor, almost hidden. If it weren't for her pink shirt, we wouldn't have seen her. For a second, I thought she might still be alive because the angle of her body looked less like a fall than a person trying to make herself small enough not to be seen. Then I climbed up to check and saw her face. There was no blood to speak of, no mauling, no obvious tearing. Just terror fixed into her so completely it looked carved there. Her hands were shredded at the fingertips from trying to climb bare rock. The soles of both feet were cut raw. She had lost both shoes somewhere in the dark. One of my rangers asked if she could have gotten trapped and died of exposure. I said maybe, because that was the answer that fit the shape of the world best. But when I looked into the little pocket where her body had been forced, I saw pale flakes caught on the stone behind her head. Thin, dry, translucent scraps like shed skin. I said nothing about that either. I just pulled her out as gently as possible and lowered her body down. Then I radioed for an extraction team. Once her body was on its way out of the cave, we pushed on. The second girl was alive when we found her, though barely. She was curled in a low slot beyond a crawl space, so tight I had to turn my head sideways to breathe while pulling myself through. She was hypothermic, hysterical, and so dehydrated her lips had cracked at the edges. When my light found her, she started sobbing so hard she nearly choked, then clamped both hands over her mouth as if she had learned the hard way not to make noise. I got water into her a little at a time and asked where her friend was. She shook her head violently and pointed deeper into the cave. "It took her," she whispered. I asked who. Her eyes slid past me to the dark behind us, and she managed to get out one word: monsters. I got the rest of the team to start moving her back toward the wider passage, while I questioned her as quickly as I could. The story came in pieces, broken by shivering and shock. They had gotten lost after trying to find a side chamber somebody online claimed had glowworms and underground pools. Their lights started acting strangely. One girl swore she heard someone breathing behind a wall. Another thought she saw movement on the ceiling. They tried to turn back and could not find the same passage they came through. Then they started hearing clicking. At first they thought it was water. Then they realized it answered itself. One of the girls panicked and ran. They all ran after that. The third girl had made it farthest into the dark. When I asked what she meant by monsters, she froze. Her eyes locked on the cave wall behind me, and after a long silence, she whispered that it looked like a cave devil. Something pale with long arms, skin like a snake in places, and a face that looked almost human until it moved. We handed her off to the others and started pulling back. That should have been the end of it. One body recovered, one survivor out, one missing. Enough to regroup, bring in more people, reset the search with daylight and support. But just as we reached the wider passage, we heard the third girl scream. Not far away, not echoing through the whole cave. Close. I told the others to get the survivor out and call for rope support, more lights, more people. One of the rangers started to argue, but I snapped at him harder than I meant to and told him to move. The truth was simple. If that girl was still alive, waiting could kill her. I turned and ran towards the sound before anyone could stop me. The scream came again, raw and desperate, cut off halfway through as if something had put a hand over her mouth. Then there was silence. No, not silence. Breathing. Fast. Human. Coming from somewhere deeper ahead. That was the closest I ever came to not coming back out. The tunnel ahead was not on any map I had seen. It forked twice, then narrowed into a descending corridor where the walls leaned inward close enough to brush both shoulders if I did not turn slightly. The smell down there was stronger than anywhere else in the cave. Damp stone, old waste, blood, and that same hot reptile smell I had caught in the second encounter, as though something cold-blooded had made a nest in wet rock and fouled the air around it for years. My flashlight beam shook over slick stone and black pockets where the floor dropped away into water or pits too deep to judge. More than once I heard movement beside me inside the walls themselves, not in the open passage but behind it. A soft, dry sliding, then a click, then another farther off. Then I heard the girl crying. She was somewhere ahead, weak now, trying to call for help and failing. The tunnel opened into a chamber so suddenly I almost walked off the edge of it. The floor dropped into a bowl-shaped hollow strewn with old debris. Broken helmets, rusted flashlight casings, pieces of clothing, bones, cast off. At the far end of the chamber, under a low overhang where the stone split into several narrow black seams, the girl was on the ground trying to crawl. One ankle was twisted wrong. Her shirt had been torn open at one shoulder. She looked up when my light hit her and made a sound so full of relief it still hurts to remember. Then something moved between us. It rose from where I had taken it for a boulder at the edge of the chamber. At first all I saw was a back bent low, limbs folded in, skin stretched tight over spine and ribs. Then it stood higher, not fully upright, but enough. The head lifted, one hand braced against stone. It was taller than the others I had seen before, or maybe just leaner in a way that made the height more obvious. The skin along its back and shoulders had that same dry, plate-like texture in patches, like scales pressed close to flesh. In the beam, parts of it looked almost gray and papery, while other places shone faintly as if damp. The neck was long and worked when it breathed, and the sides of it caught the light with a dull, overlapping sheen that made my stomach tighten. Its face was not animal. That would have been easier. It was close enough to human that every small difference felt like blasphemy. Eyes too deep, mouth too wide, skin too drawn across the bones. And the way it looked at me was not the blind aggression of an animal protecting a den. It was judgment, calculation, interest. The girl tried to drag herself backward. The creature moved before she got 6 inches. It crossed the space between them with a speed I was not prepared for. One hand and both feet striking stone in quick, practiced hits, body hugging the ground and then lifting in the same motion. I shouted and ran downslope, more to make noise than because I had any plan. It turned toward me, and in that second I saw the third thing that still comes back in my nightmares. Smaller shapes behind it, pressed into the wall seams, faces and hands just visible where the cracks widened, watching. I hit the larger one's shoulder first and drove it sideways off the girl. We went down together hard enough to knock the wind out of me. Up close, the skin felt not slick but dry and rough in patches, as if scales and scar tissue had grown over one another for years. It smelled like cave water, rot, and hot dust. One of its hands hit my chest, and the pressure in it was shocking, stronger than something that thin had any right to be. I got the flashlight between us and jammed the beam into its face. It recoiled just enough for me to kick free, grab the girl under the arms, and drag her downslope. It came after us immediately, not alone. Clicks broke out all along the chamber wall. Hands appeared in the seams, pale limbs folded out from cracks too narrow to explain. I pulled the girl backward while swinging the flashlight with my free hand, catching one in the shoulder, another across the jaw. Something raked my left arm through the sleeve hard enough to tear fabric and skin together. Another hit my back from above, driving me to one knee. The girl screamed. I remember shouting for the team, though I knew they were too far back to hear clearly. Then a light exploded into the chamber from the passage behind us. One of the rangers had come back. I have never been so relieved to see another human being in my life. The chamber went wild for a few seconds after that. Flashlights cutting across stone, creatures slipping in and out of cracks, the clicking turning sharp and frantic. We got the girl between us and started hauling her uphill toward the passage. I kept expecting something to hit us from behind at any moment. Instead, they stayed close enough to keep us moving. Close enough that when I looked back, I saw faces opening and closing from the seams in the rock as if the chamber walls themselves were alive. The larger one followed the farthest. It came low and fast, then stopped just short of the passage narrowing, one hand against the wall, head lifted, watching me the way it had watched before. Not furious, not mindless, measuring. Then it made a sound I will never forget. Not a click this time. Something lower. Almost like a laugh dragged through a throat not built for it. We got out. The girl survived, barely. She spent a week in the hospital before she could tell us enough to be useful. And even then, most of what she said came in fragments. She said the creatures had moved around them for hours before they finally showed themselves. That at first they thought the sounds were echoes. Then they thought maybe there were other hikers deeper in the cave. Then one of them stood up out of the dark, and they realized it had been in the chamber with them the whole time. She said they watched from the walls, that they seemed to know the cave the way fish know water. She said the one that took her had touched her face with fingers that felt dry and cold as old paper. We recovered the first girl's body. The third survived. The second did not. She died in the hospital 3 days later. And what we found in that final chamber was enough to shut the cave system down permanently under the language of instability, predator intrusion, and unsafe subterranean conditions. Those words made the paperwork possible. They did not make the truth smaller. The truth is that by the third encounter, I stopped thinking of those things as cave dwellers. in the way people mean when they want to tell themselves they are just talking about feral humans. What I saw down there was older than that. Something that moved through stone and dark and cold, like it had been created there in the inky blackness. And on the night I almost got dragged into that chamber with the rest of what it had taken, I understood something I still wish I did not know. Some things do not live under the earth because they are hiding. Some things live there because it is where they belong. After that encounter with whatever those creatures were, I did not come out of it the same man who went in. Maybe that sounds dramatic, but there are some places that leave a mark deeper than fear. You can scrub the mud off your boots. You can file the report. You can tell yourself you did your job and brought back who you could. But some things stay with you. The smell of wet stone and old rot. The sound of clicking deep in the dark. The sight of something pale and half-hidden flattening itself into a crack in the wall, as if the earth had opened just enough to let it slip through. People can call it folklore, panic, trauma, anything that helps them sleep. I know what I saw in those caves, and I know there are places under this world where something ancient still moves in the dark, waiting for the lost, the unlucky, or the foolish enough to go too far in. Thank you for joining me tonight on Whispers After Dark, where the shadows speak and the night listens. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Be sure to check out our playlists in the description below for even more eerie tales waiting in the dark. And if you've heard stories like these before or have one of your own, leave us a comment. I'd love to hear it. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and beware of the whispers after dark.